Good morning, church. It's nice to be here with you this morning, this close to the ocean and this close to winter at the same time. The gospel lessons from the 4th chapter of Luke. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the river Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tested by the devil. He ate nothing at all during those days, and when they were over, he was famished. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." Jesus answered him, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone." Then the devil led him up and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And the devil said to him, "To you I will give all the authority and all the power and their glory, for it has been given to me, and I give it to anyone I want. If you then worship me, it can all be yours." Jesus answered him, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil led him to Jerusalem, placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, God will command the angels concerning you to protect you. And on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished every test, he departed from Jesus until a more opportune time. Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God. So Lent began Wednesday. I arrived in LA at 4:47 and found the only 7 o'clock service in the Presbyterian Church in this presbytery and went. In the front of that sanctuary was the scorched church's cross pulled from the remains of Pacific Palisades. And I thought to myself, this year, how can anyone who lives this close to such complete destruction bear to hear the words, "Remember you are dust, and to dust we shall return"? It's hard to watch your neighbors, to watch everything you may have worked for, loved. Hard to watch your sense of safety and belonging crumble into ashes. You know this who have watched neighbors, perhaps family members, whose homes and work and neighborhoods have evaporated. The people of Western North Carolina, where we are still working after the devastating floods from Hurricane Helene, still digging out, they know this. The people of Gaza, of Ukraine, of the countless places that the offices I work alongside seek to serve and support after catastrophe or violence. They know this. Some of us would say that we know this too, just as an American people in these days, as our sense of what is the common good, as our sense of a country that is united, fractures beneath the weight of our increasing polarization. Lent is a season lasting 40 days, and it is meant to be kind of a metaphor to help the people of God along the path that Jesus and his followers took as Jesus concluded his public ministry and began his slow walk to betrayal, suffering, and death before his resurrection. There, when he went to Jerusalem, the forces of empire, Rome at the time, combined to put Jesus on the cross. And his followers were scattered, and the movement that they had built so tenderly, a movement of healing and of service and of love, crumbled under the fear and the mutual accusation. These stories we have just read, the story about Moses and his people in the wilderness, story about Jesus in the wilderness, give us this time frame, and that's where we got the 40 days of Lent from our forebears in the Christian movement, as a way of saying in shorthand, times like this, times of death and dying and destruction, they go on forever. So when you see those numbers, 40 days in the Bible, you know that those people were saying, this feels like it's going to go on forever. And we know that it's true. Or at least it feels true. Whether it's a personal crisis, a death in the family, a divorce, a loss of a job, it feels like forever and like we will never return to the life we had and we treasured, the life where we felt that God was with us, blessing us, and life was good. During the war in Syria, really not totally ended now as they've gone into a new season of government, but during the heyday of the war in Syria, my work in Presbyterian disaster assistance gave me an opportunity to develop some wonderful, rich friendships with some of the pastors and congregations in that country. One of my good friends, Mofid, was at the time the pastor of the church in Homs, which in 2012 was destroyed by fights between the resistance and the government, and everyone left, and then when they came back in 2014, it all happened again. My friend, Mofid, decided that he could not leave his church and his people, though by that time his church was rubble. And so he sent his family to safety, relatively, in Beirut, Lebanon, and he moved into the old folks' home that his church ran and lived in a room there, running back and forth to parishioners' houses while bombardment went on around him. He talked to me about the vulnerability he felt, the vulnerability of his people, how they had no economic security, no physical security, no spiritual or emotional sense of well-being. He said, some of my people have moved away. They have moved away from God because they are angry. Some of my people have a formula in their mind that the Bible taught us, and they are angry and they are afraid. We thank God for the good things that happen to us, they say. So why can't we blame God for the evil things that happen to us? Mofid described how, like Jesus in the desert, and like the people Moses had, the members of his church had been tested and tried. Why did you allow this, God? They said. Where are you? Do we deserve what is happening to us? Mofid said. Some of the people said, the tsunami people were being punished because they weren't Christians. The Iraqis in the other war were being punished, but we, what have we done except praise your name and love you? We have a lady in the church, Mofid said, a widow. She's 30 years old. She has 2 children. She doesn't work. She doesn't have a degree. Her father is dead. Her husband was killed by a sniper. She asks me, her pastor, why has God abandoned me? He said, I reach places where I am depressed and lost and without peace. Before, preaching and being in church was a beautiful ritual and an art. It was a tool to change our small corner of the world and to bless our children. But now, in this crisis, we are demanded to ask impossible questions and to answer them. We are like Jesus in the garden, Mofid ended, praying, "Take this cup away from me." And then he fell silent because sometimes silence is the only way to honor a pain that is so deep and questions that are far beyond easy answers. For these 40 days, in what the church also calls, as if we hadn't figured it out already, by the long, slow songs and by the solemn texts that we are invited to read, Lent is a solemn season. The members of the last church I served before going to the National Church in Miami had a different way of describing it, though. When we pulled out the slow hymns and the minor keyed music, and the music minister said, "You have to hold your breath for this entire line. You can't take a breath here." And the choir members would say, "Lent, bummer." And they weren't wrong. Because who wants to willingly immerse yourself in hard stories when life is already hard enough? But the two stories we have just read both cite this metaphoric time period to remind us that these serious times that our biblical characters endured and that sometimes we endure are meant to underscore not their suffering or their temptation or our sin, I would even say, but rather they are meant to give us some choices to make during seasons that are difficult for us, to provide us with kind of a practice area to discern how we want to be when such times come to us or to our neighbors up the Pacific Coast Highway. When the law was received by the Hebrew wanderers in their desert journey, in the passage we just read, the story said the mountain that Moses went up on was covered with cloud, but to the people below, it looked like a devouring fire. Sadly, you know exactly what that looks like. The story also tells us that after Moses spent his 40 days up there and he came back with the 10 Commandments, he was so changed by that experience that the skin of his face shone. He didn't notice it, but when he tried to come back to his community, to his family, to his people, they pulled away from him. He was different. The story tells us he was so changed that they were afraid. And they begged him, "Don't come near us. Stay away." So Moses, his choice was to hide the way he had been changed. The story that comes after says he wore a veil. It was a deal he worked out with his family so that they wouldn't have to think about what he had been through. He wore a mask. And he hid from them the cost of the time on the mountain so that he could live among them. How hard it is to hear these stories that change us. How hard it is to tell stories not about our well-being, but about our brokenness. And how tempting it is to pretend that though the very foundations of our lives are shattered, we are fine. Fine. Thank you for asking. Moses failed himself, but Jesus chose a different path in his dance with the devil in the desert. Hungry and alone, he was offered 3 ways of getting out of the alienation and the distance and the fear he experienced. First, he was offered by the devil a life of complete self-sufficiency to turn stones into bread. Sufficient insurance, sufficient food and money in the bank, a secure life, and never again having to depend on anyone for anything. Imagine. But Jesus said, no, that's not how I'm meant to live. It's not who I am. Next, and this one's playing out a little bit, I think, in our public life together, Jesus was offered absolute power to control his world and the world all around him. But again, he said, no, that's not how human beings are meant to be. Finally, and poignantly, he was reminded, as my friend Mofid was reminded, that life can be terrible and risky. And the devil said, throw yourself off the top of the temple, risk your very life, and prove whether God really is here for you. Prove whether God will really show up when you need God the most, when your life is at stake. But Jesus would not turn his back on believing in the presence and fidelity of God, not then, and not later, even when he cried from the cross to one he could not hear and who he believed had abandoned him, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus said no. These stories tell us that there are ways through our wildernesses, our losses, ways that don't require us to hide ourselves from the people we love or the communities that we are a part of. Ways that honor hard paths, ways that hold tenderly the hurt places in our hearts and in our families and in our communities and in our world. Ways to practice being more human rather than to barricade and hide ourselves and become less human. The songwriter and poet Leonard Cohen wrote a song called Anthem that I love, and it contains this line: ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. It's how the light gets in. Cohen was Jewish, and I think he got lines and the image for this song from the sacred mystical book of Judaism called the Zohar. In it, there's a creation story very different from the one we learned together in Genesis. It's a story in which God created the world by sending divine light through 10 holy vessels, through a waterfall, down to earth to be shed like a watershed among the creation as it came to life. But as that light was falling to the earth, it was too powerful and too big to be contained, and so the 10 vessels shattered, and all the pieces of pottery fell to the earth and scattered. Holiness fell to the depths, and light was imprisoned within the small pieces of cracked and destroyed remnants. So it is, the Zohar teaches, that God and God's light is hidden, exiled in brokenness, in human form. And the Zohar also teaches that we, the human family, were created to be those pieces of broken pottery and to come together, bearing the light that is within us, until when the day to come is here that we are fulfilled and returned to God's presence. All our broken pieces will be knit together, and the light will be whole, and we will be healed. What we're invited to practice during Lent is not a denial of ourselves or a constant hammering that we are sinful and God is disappointed in us. Rather, I think it is a practice of embracing our deepest selves, our fully honest selves, our deepest truth. Choosing to remain fully human and present to others, broken, vulnerable, and connected. It doesn't need to destroy us, but rather, I think it frees us to become agents in the world, God's people in the world. It's the children saying, we made kits to help the people who lost everything in the fire. It's the generations of fish boxes going back to my childhood, in which kids stole money from their parents, as we learned today, and and gave it to the church so that little bits of money could come together in one large piece of money, and there would be resources for the people in Syria and the people in Gaza and North Carolina and Southern California, so that they would know that God's people stand with them and that the people of Jesus Christ can face hurt and brokenness and not turn away. It's being willing to believe that if we take off the veils and the masks that we so often use to hide our pain from each other, if we break our silence and allow people to hear and see who we really are, that the light shining through the cracks will touch someone else and maybe light another person's path. A few days ago, we were up in Altadena, and we met with a bunch of Presbyterians and other folks, and then we were asked if we would be willing to go to the Altadena Church, which was a church that used to be called the Altadena Church of God, Anderson. And it was a bunch of folks who lived in neighborhoods in Altadena that pretty much were wiped out. The pastor brought together about 30 people, I think everyone in the room of whom had lost their home, or most of it. And they sat in a circle. And the pastor said, please, if you're willing, tell your stories to these strangers because they want to listen and learn. So one by one, people told terrible stories. And from time to time, someone would say, oh, but wait, yesterday I signed a 36-month lease with a fixed price. And even those who were still living in hotels stopped in the midst of their tears and applauded and got up to hug the one whose life was starting to change finally for the better. I noticed that about half of the group were wearing black t-shirts or sweatshirts, and there was a rose coming out of the top of the sweatshirt, and when I looked more closely, there was a pile of ashes from which that rose was growing. And the words around that picture were, "Beauty will rise." So near the end of our time together, I said, I'm noticing many of you are wearing these sweatshirts and t-shirts, and I'm wondering if there's a story that someone would be willing to share about these t-shirts. The pastor stood up and said, I went a couple weeks ago to one of our houses to pray, and it was just ashes. And I stood in the ashes and wept, and then suddenly a text from Isaiah came to me, and a song from that text that I remember learning 10 years ago when my 14-year-old daughter died unexpectedly, a song that I put on repeat and played over and over and over again just so I could get up and face the day. The song is "Beauty Will Rise," he said. Many of us are familiar with the beginning of Isaiah 61. It's the words Jesus used when he started his public ministry. "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because God has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, to lift up the brokenhearted." But the part that spoke to Kerwin was this: "And to provide to those who grieve, to give them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair." And when he finished quoting those words, he looked up and he looked around at the people of his church and he smiled. And his face shone. And all of us could see the light. Please pray with me. It's in every one of us to be wise. Warm your hearts, open up both your eyes. We can all know everything without ever asking why. It's in every one of us, by and by. It's in every one of us, by